So, in spite of my initial protests, I have seen Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey. And, well, let's just say, I was right not to have any expectations, and everyone glazing this film needs to learn to think for themselves, because it is nowhere remotely close to being the masterpiece the internet hive mind has decided it is. There are so many issues with its execution that it honestly feels amateurish, and I could spend at least half an hour going through them here if I wanted to. However, I'm not going to do that because, as I hope you noticed, there was another adaptation of this quintessential epic in the thumbnail that I'm going to be talking about as well. While you can be sure I'll take every opportunity to roast Nolan's latest vanity project, this video is not going to be dedicated to exposing every reason the film didn't work for me. If you would like to hear me tear it apart point by point, you can check out my Letterboxd review, which will be linked below, but today I'm just going to be focused on Nolan's misguided vision and why I believe he failed to effectively reinvent and modernize the story. You see, reinvention and modernization, while potentially dangerous without proper understanding of or respect for the original work, aren't inherently bad things when done right, and I feel we have the perfect example to compare to Nolan's attempts so we can analyze how to go about reimagining a story like The Odyssey. In case you need introduced to Epic the Musical, it is one of the greatest masterpieces of storytelling in any medium I have ever experienced, and you have no idea what you are missing out on. It's one of those things that not nearly enough people are familiar with thanks to its unconventional format, but I'm hardly aware of anyone who has experienced it who hasn't instantly fallen in love and found their personality completely defined by it. I mean, in the months since I first listened to it, not a day has gone by in which I haven't found myself singing it to myself, and I take any reasonable opportunity to share it with anyone I can. But enough glazing, what actually is it? Well, the short version is that it's a series of concept albums based on The Odyssey, composed by Jorge Rivera Herranz, which not only gained its fan base, but even recruited its cast via TikTok, making this the one good justification for that site's existence. Countless talented artists have made animatics for each and every song, so you can go onto YouTube and watch any of the equally countless compilations of these animatics right now. I'll get more into what makes the collaborative way the story has grown so cool later in the video, but if that seems too niche for you to get into, it is getting an animated film treatment at some point in the near future, thanks to Jerry Bruckheimer. In other words, I can console myself on the letdown that was this year's Odyssey adaptation by knowing the next one will show everyone how it's done. But of course, it's time for me to explain why that is. But before we get into it, you should know that I'm just thinking out loud here, so if you like my brain vomit, you know where the like and subscribe buttons are. Now without further ado, let's dive into the two most recent and popular takes on The Odyssey and how each of them reimagined the ancient classic for the modern day. But before getting into what they changed, I want to quickly look at what each retained, because each adaptation kept a key element of how the original story was told, but I only feel one utilized this element to its fullest extent. In the case of Epic, this element is, of course, its nature as a musical. The Odyssey wasn't originally a book. It was a tradition of oral poetry, or in other words, music. I don't know if Jorge had this in mind when he conceptualized the project, but intentionally or not, this is potentially the perfect medium to modernize the story, perhaps giving us some approximation of how ancient people would have experienced it. And while this aspect was almost certainly more incidental, the way the music has allowed countless artists to imagine the story for themselves in a variety of ways as the fandom has grown and evolved also feels true to the way the original poem surely allowed generations throughout history to imagine and artistically interpret the events of the poem for themselves across time. I'm not saying it's a perfect one-to-one comparison, and this is obviously a very different kind of music from what the ancient Greeks were used to, but hey, I'm inclined to think they'd recognize it as music long before whatever Nolan had Travis Scott doing. Seriously, as dumb as I think Nolan's comparison of oral poetry to rap was, I almost wish Travis Scott had rapped in the movie, because how are the characters calling this meaningless, rhythmless chanting music? Anyway, sorry for the tangent, though I'm sure it won't be the last. In Nolan's case, the element he chose to keep from the original story was the non-linear way it was told. While the exact framing device differs, in both cases, the adventure is merely related by Odysseus to an audience on his last stop before returning home, making up only a small fraction of the original poem and about a third of the film's runtime if I had to guess. However, I don't feel Nolan effectively translates the original narrative format to the big screen in a way that feels like anything more than his usual gimmick of putting the scenes of his films on shuffle in the editing room. To be clear, I don't think Nolan should have copied the narrative structure directly from the story, reducing the entire epic adventure to a single 20 to 30 minute montage in the middle of the film. That certainly wouldn't have pleased anyone. However, with perhaps the exception of how the sack of Troy was revealed in chunks revealed at key points throughout, the constant cutting between timelines doesn't alter the way the events themselves are experienced in any meaningful way, or create a more complete overarching narrative. Since the flashbacks are told so objectively and we spend so much time in them, the fact that they are flashbacks is completely incidental, and making them flashbacks at all only serves to detach us from their part of the story and reduce the amount of time we get to spend in it. And while that's already not great, what really makes this frustrating is that the present-day story is not engaging enough to make up for it, providing only a series of repetitive scenes of people talking about nothing worth remembering by the next scene, with no urgent stakes and few active decisions being made. And thus, we spend the entirety of those scenes just wanting to get back to the flashbacks. You could cut all the scenes of Matt Damon aimlessly wandering around an island with Charlize Theron while she tries to either get him to quit his Lotus addiction or keep him hooked based on the arbitrary whims of the script. Not to mention the tensionless scenes of Tom Holland chatting with Jon Bernthal, and it would only make what's left far more engaging. There's really not much reason for the story to be told the way it is here. Compare that to the original story, where the entire adventure is recounted by Odysseus to his Phaeacian hosts, and we're left to wonder if he's even a reliable narrator, and how much he might be fabricating or embellishing his own story. Of course, no such ambiguity or subjectivity is present in any Nolan film. Just imagine if Odysseus spent his time on Calypso's island actively searching his wreckage for clues about his past and interrogating his captor with specific flashbacks triggered by particular clues, and the flashbacks themselves presented in a more subjective, almost POV style that reminds us we are in his memories. We would be actively piecing together his story along with him, rather than just passively waiting to get back to the real story in the space between each flashback. And imagine if Telemachus faced a bit more in the way of obstacles in his efforts to meet and learn what he wanted from Menelaus, and if the flashback to Troy was similarly subjective, but from Menelaus' perspective, with a focus on how Odysseus seemed to his men. Might that have made the nonlinear format feel far more intentional and effective? This is not to say I have no respect for Nolan's attempt to tell the story the way he did. In fact, he very well may have done it far more effectively than I could have in his place. Unfortunately, I just feel he did it purely for the sake of doing it without any of the original intent or effect. Compare this to Epic, which managed to capture something foundational to the way the story was experienced for centuries and translate it for our generation in a way no other treatment of the story I know of has ever even attempted. Now to dive into how each of these adaptations went about reimagining the story, and why I take issue with Nolan's choices so much more than those made in Epic. Let's start with how they go about depicting the world of the Odyssey, including both the historical and cultural setting, and the general tone, look, and internal logic of the world. I'm going to keep this section relatively brief, because I have a whole video on the subject of historical authenticity in relation to Nolan's questionable creative decisions, which you can check out after this one, but as mentioned, I'm going to be going a bit beyond historicity in this discussion and giving Epic a closer look than I did in that video. To once again start with Epic, I should make clear right off the bat that in terms of the look of the world and its historical accuracy, there's no definitive interpretation to judge as of yet, so we'll be going off of general trends across its many visual depictions, and primarily focusing on the choices made in the music. While I have seen some impressively historically accurate artistic depictions, for the most part, the artists involved in this project tend not to be too concerned with historicity, and I can't entirely blame them for that. After all, if Jorge had been concerned about it himself, surely he wouldn't have so drastically reimagined the characters, as we'll come back to later, used so much modern musical influence and instrumentation, and taken so much inspiration from pop culture sources such as anime and video games. Heck, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it was him who originally promoted the anachronistic depictions of Polites with glasses and Eurylochus with a giant buster sword. This is not trying to be a historically grounded homage to the ancient culture that gave us the story, but an unabashedly modern reinvention that celebrates one of the greatest influences on our storytelling by bringing an eclectic variety of modern influences back to the original story. And that's why it works so well. It knows exactly what it is and what it's trying to accomplish. It's not trying to sweep you off to the ancient world and recreate something from another time. It's trying to give you a brand new experience unlike any other, one rooted in our current time in the best way possible. This is made to be for us what the Odyssey was for its time. Nolan, on the other hand, doesn't seem so sure of what he wants to accomplish. His interpretation is just as anachronistic as Epic in the language the characters speak, the diverse casting, and the ridiculous outfits. But unlike Epic, he never fully commits to this being a modern reimagining. The whole thing has an incredibly gritty tone and grounded world building, and choices like composing the score using only period-appropriate instruments demonstrate that he wants to create the illusion that you are stepping into ancient Greece. And that is what makes the terrible costume design and the cast, seemingly plucked from the streets of modern LA, feel so jarring. Nolan seems to love the idea of authenticity and realism, but is clearly too lazy to bother committing to it. And so he settles for vaguely evoking the vibes of realism by making everything look as drab and generic as possible. And that leads to the other major reason this approach fails where Epic succeeds. Every artist bringing Epic to life is focused on making everything as striking and unique, as awesome and beautiful as they can. And for the most part, they succeed. So no one is watching their work thinking about how unrealistic it is. Meanwhile, Nolan, in his love of superficial realism, can't allow himself to do the one thing that could distract from how inaccurate his depiction of ancient Greece is, and that is to make it look distinct and cool. His defenders will say that historical accuracy doesn't matter all day long, but I'm yet to hear a single person say the costumes in this film actually look good. When he is clearly trying to make this film look realistic, but only succeeds in making it look ugly, when the truly realistic version would have looked so much cooler, there's no reason not to be upset. As you can see, the problem here isn't reimagining or modernization, but indecisiveness and a lack of any kind of clear vision or intent. Nolan's film is caught in limbo between two very different kinds of movies, but can't commit to be either. And this isn't just a problem with costume design, but the rules and tone of the world itself. Nolan obviously wants to downplay the presence of the supernatural and divine in this world, whether because he just doesn't know how to handle such narrative elements, or because he intentionally wanted to secularize the story and characters to fit his themes and appeal to modern audiences. I suspect the answer is both. However, while he successfully makes the existence of the gods somewhat ambiguous, he's obviously not bold enough to remove the rest of Odysseus' supernatural encounters and fully ground the story in reality, nor does he care to present the magical events in a subjective light, as I've already described. Another route he could have gone would have been to explore how real people in the real ancient world would have interacted with real magic if they discovered it and tried to fit it into their limited worldviews. But that doesn't seem to have crossed his mind either. He tries so hard to make his world feel believable and mundane, and he instills it with an unhealthy dose of modern skepticism. Yet he presents the supernatural so matter-of-factly that there's nothing particularly mysterious or existentially terrifying about it as you'd expect in the world he's presenting, leaving its place in it incredibly vague, and making me once again feel that Nolan simply couldn't commit to either a fully grounded or fully fantastical approach to adapting this story. In short, Epic could get away with playing so loosely with its fictional and real-world setting because it had a clear, distinct, and awesome vision of its own. But because Nolan's vision feels very unclear and seems to be trying to evoke a strong semblance of realism without any apparent attempt at authenticity, it leaves itself utterly unable to immerse me in its world and inspire anything but confusion. If you're gonna go for realism, go for realism. And if not, do something cool enough to justify it. Now let's end this video with what might be the most important section, or at least the one that started this whole video. Both of these adaptations make dramatic changes to the titular character and use a familiar plot to tackle ideas nowhere to be found in the text. In short, they're bad adaptations that make no attempt to convey the original intent whatsoever. However, in the case of Epic, I couldn't care less because the story is profoundly moving, whereas I find it frustrating in Nolan's take because it left me feeling nothing. This section of the video is not going to be a deep dive into the themes of each of these three very different stories. That's how I initially conceived this video, but I would need to give the Odyssey a fresh read and take some time to ponder it before making that video. And in the meantime, I wanted the chance to complain more about Nolan's film, so it morphed into this broader comparison of the two adaptations. To be sure, I still hope to revisit the themes of these stories down the road, but in the meantime, let me just analyze why Epic's original ideas resonated so deeply with me, while Nolan's didn't. And truth be told, it has little, if anything, to do with the ideas themselves, and everything to do with how the ideas are incorporated into their respective narratives. And in both cases, it all comes down to how theme collides with character. In Epic, the central theme serves as the core internal conflict driving Odysseus' character through the story. The theme is essentially what makes a man into a monster, and whether it's truly possible to go through life with clean hands. It posits that ruthlessness on our enemies is mercy upon ourselves, and it suggests that love requires us to sacrifice our principles and perhaps even our humanity. It doesn't just state these things as facts, but invites the audience to ponder them for themselves and come to their own conclusions. Additionally, Odysseus himself wrestles with these questions throughout the story, motivating every choice he makes, and each encounter on his journey pushes him one way or the other on this debate. The story's ideas are inseparable from the plot, and just about every musical number makes some comment on them. The themes aren't just talked about, they're explored through the characters' actions, and we have no choice but to wrestle with them ourselves as we watch Odysseus broken and reforged time and again by his experiences and decisions until he is unrecognizable from the man we met at the start. You could remove any of the brilliant lyrics about guilt, ruthlessness, and love, and the events of the story alone would still speak volumes about those subjects. But you couldn't remove the events of a single saga without Odysseus' arc falling apart. That's the evidence of some brilliant thematic writing. Then we have Nolan's take. The ideas he wants to explore are far less personal to Odysseus as a character, instead pondering the impact of the Trojan War on history and the importance of principles of common decency to a functioning society. This debate, if you can even call it that, doesn't really affect Odysseus' actions throughout the story in any meaningful way, and rather than him demonstrating a clear, specific conflict tied to this theme throughout, he's just carrying around a generic cloud of guilt and trauma from the beginning of the film to the end. There are hints of internal conflict at various points, but they're never clear or consistent enough to get you invested in any apparent arc. It's suggested once or twice that he is ambivalent about going home at all, and we learn why by the end, but this doesn't impact any of his actions in any real way. The only choice he makes that could be motivated by this conflict is his choice not to take the most established route home, but it seems he's trying to take a more direct route, so it honestly appears like he's desperate to get home as soon as possible. And this is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of seemingly inconsistent characterization. He's clearly intended to be seen as crafty and prideful like his counterpart from the original text, but his actions never demonstrate these traits. In fact, more often than not, he seems kind of dumb and impulsive. The clearest character trait he demonstrates is his unwillingness to abandon or sacrifice any of his men, even telling Circe and Tiresias that he will defy the gods before doing so. But then when it seems that principle will finally be tested as he faces Charybdis and Scylla, well, we get what might be the dumbest scene in the film. He initially seems to hold to his original commitment by risking the lives of all his men to sail past Charybdis, only for the crew to mutiny and get several of them killed. So far, we haven't had much character growth or conflict, but at least he's been consistent in this one regard. But then everyone, including Odysseus himself, starts acting like it was his idea all along to sacrifice 6 of his men, and he expresses no remorse over this decision. So either Nolan forgot how he had started the scene when he finished it, or this is the dumbest and most pointless attempt at reverse psychology I've ever seen. But either way, we see no discernible growth between the Odysseus who refused to leave any men behind under any circumstances up until this point, and the Odysseus who callously calculates the most utilitarian option in any scenario. And after this point, he doesn't even seem particularly distraught when his men doom themselves on Helios' isle, offering little more than an exasperated "I told you so." From then on, his guilt over losing all his men never comes up again, being completely eclipsed by his traumatic musings over the societal ramifications of his actions in Troy. So let's talk about that. Right before the climax of the film, Odysseus tells Penelope about the sack of Troy, which we witness while he waxes poetic about how his actions have brought about the collapse of Bronze Age civilization. And yes, he does describe it in pretty much those exact terms like a modern historian with an omniscient bird's eye view of history. Now, I do think this scene mostly works, minus the clunkiness of some of the dialogue, and I kind of like the way Nolan wants to reframe the whole concept of the Trojan horse as a profane violation of something sacred with irreversible societal ramifications Odysseus must reckon with. That is, I like that idea on paper. In execution, it feels like the story just pauses so Nolan can use the protagonist's mouth to give a pretentious lecture to the audience before the plot resumes, which is pretty typical for a Nolan film. The themes, as potentially interesting as they might have been, feel totally incidental to the story rather than serving as its beating heart. And if you cut that one flashback scene from the film, absolutely nothing about the plot is affected whatsoever. yet the entire story is rendered completely hollow. Which is exactly what I said cannot be said of any one scene in Epic. I'm not going to lie and say that Nolan's themes and character work all completely fail entirely and were fundamentally misguided from the beginning. He reimagines the central character and conflict from the ancient story, yes, and in this case I think for the worse. But Epic did the same, and it worked. The crucial difference, I feel, is that in Epic, the ideas serve to drive and develop the character of Odysseus, while in Nolan's Odyssey, Odysseus merely serves to deliver Nolan's ideas to the audience. Before I leave you today, I want to just say that my feelings towards Nolan's Odyssey have changed somewhat since I saw it, and even since starting this video. No, I'm not any less frustrated with its issues, but whereas I was initially just angry at Nolan for making a bad movie, the more I've thought about the film while writing this, compared it to other recent disappointments, and listened to the quite evocative score, the more I have to give Nolan respect for what he attempted, and I'm just sad that I feel he fumbled it so hard when there is so much potential readily apparent on the screen. This isn't an irredeemable disaster. It's just what happens when incredible ambition is not given clear enough vision, and one man's talent is taken so much for granted that it seems no one can give him notes. However, as disappointed as I am that we weren't given the definitive cinematic translation of the epic text that I had once hoped this would be, I am even more excited to be getting the definitive visual adaptation of what is already easily the greatest modern interpretation of this classic story finally brought to the big screen. But what do you think? Do you feel Nolan failed to reinvent the story as successfully as Epic, or do you disagree? If you do, I'd love to know why. Share your thoughts on each of these adaptations and how they compare down in the comments, and I look forward to joining you in the conversation down below. Oh, and since the discussion surrounding this film has gotten so needlessly toxic, let's keep it civil down there, alright? Until next time, just keep thinking out loud.